This CACFP meal pattern webinar on creditable and whole grain-rich grains was recorded on August 11, 2020, and presented to a family daycare home provider audience. The information presented in this training will be applicable to all child and adult care food program sponsors and daycare home providers. The version you are currently viewing has been edited and shortened from the original. Handouts for this training are available as a link below the video. This training series was funded by a grant from the USDA. In this webinar, we will be going over the grains component only. This will be a general overview of the grains component. While the basics of the grains component is fairly simple, it requires a bit of background knowledge on grains, and the implementation of it can be complicated. Since we only have a limited amount of time to talk about grains, we will start with a general overview of the grains requirements, including some key terms that you will need to be familiar with, and then go into three broad categories of grains: creditable grains, non-creditable grains, and whole grain-rich grains. In each of these three sections, we will go over what makes a grain creditable or not creditable, provide some examples in each category, and talk about documentation requirements. Throughout this training, there will be references to downloading handouts from the Handouts tab. For this online video, resources can be downloaded from the links available below the video. Okay, so after you finish this webinar today, I hope you'll know the basics of the CACFP grains component. You will understand which grains are creditable, and you will know which grains are whole grain rich. So in the CACFP child and adult meal patterns, the grains component must be served at breakfast, lunch, and supper. To allow for more flexibility, CACFP sponsors and providers can substitute a meat or meat alternate item for the grains component at breakfast up to 3 times a week. For snack, grains are one of the 5 different food components you can choose from. So note that this webinar will focus on the grains component as related to the child and adult meal pattern. For most of you, child meal pattern will be all that matters. Infant meal patterns have slightly different requirements. If you were part of the infant webinar just about a month ago, or actually no, 2 weeks ago, you might have heard about the different infant requirements, but we're only going to be focusing on child meal pattern today. So anytime you serve a grains component as part of a reimbursable meal, the grain item must be creditable. In addition, at least once per day, the grains component must be whole grain rich. So on the screen, the words creditable and whole grain rich are both underlined because these are specific terms that are used in the child nutrition programs. We do need to understand a few key terms for grains. And just so you all are aware, starting in October 1st, 2021, serving sizes for grains will switch over to ounce equivalents. So we're going to have more information for y'all coming in fiscal year 2021. So that starts October 1st through September. But for right now, don't worry about it too much. We'll talk about it a little bit towards the end of our webinar today. All right, so back to our key terms. You probably heard of the terms whole grains, refined grains, and rich grains before, and you probably know that whole grains are healthier for you. And the reason why they're healthier for you is because they contain the whole grain kernel. So they have everything, the whole enchilada. This includes the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. And you can see that nice graphic representation of what they look like there. So the bran, that nice outer shell, provides fiber, vitamins, minerals. The endosperm inside provides energy, carbohydrates, and protein. It's also the biggest part of the kernel. And then you have the germ, that kind of brain-looking like thing over there. It provides nourishment for the seed. It also has antioxidants, vitamin E, and B vitamins. When you have a whole grain, it contains all 3 parts of it. When you have refined grains, it takes away the bran and the germ. So all you're left is that starchy endosperm inside. And so this is why refined grains contains less nutrients, because of all the nutrients that bran and germ has. So there are some products that does use refined grains, and then they add back in some of those vitamins and minerals. And so these are called enriched grains. So no whole grains, refined grains, and enriched grains. Think about the grains that you eat. So think about those whole wheat bread that all of you love so much, or those wild rice, or that oatmeal. Do you eat more whole grains, refined grains, or enriched grains? So if you eat brown rice, you are eating a whole grain, right? It has the bran and the germ included. And the bran is the part that makes the rice brown because it has that nice cover on it. So you don't see the germ on the inside, but it's there too. If you eat white rice, however, you're eating a refined grain because what they do is they take away that germ in the bran and it leaves it nice and polished and white inside. If you eat an enriched white rice, then what you do is you're eating a rice that's refined but has added B vitamins and iron back in. And so these are the different types of rice out there. And brown rice, white rice, and enriched white rice are all very, very common in the marketplace. And they're great examples of whole grain, refined grain, and enriched grains. Now that we kind of went over this process with rice, let's kind of take an example with corn flour. If you have an example of corn flour, and I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll so you can kind of think about it as we talk. Corn flour, in this example, has been processed to remove the bran and the germ. And there is no additional vitamins or minerals that's been added in. Out of whole grain, refined grain, enriched grain, and whole grain rich grain, what type of grain product is this? And I know we haven't talked too much about whole grain rich grain, so that's a hint for y'all. All right, I'll give y'all just a few more seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out and share it. And so we're kind of mixed a little bit. Some people think it's a refined grain. Some people think it's an enriched grain. Actually, we have a few who think it's a whole grain and who thinks it's a whole grain rich grain. And so this is actually really interesting because corn flour is actually a refined grain. Maybe I threw you all off when I said we haven't talked about whole grain rich grains yet. The reason why this is a refined grain is because the bran and the germ has been removed. So once you remove it, there's really not as much vitamins or minerals in there. And if you're not adding in any additional vitamins and minerals, it can't be an enriched grain. All right. So hopefully this is clear. If not, feel free to ask your questions. We'll clear it up later on down the line. All right, let's move on to creditable grains. Once you understand what is a whole grain, what is an enriched grain, and what is a refined grain, we can start talking a little bit about creditable grains. Creditable grains is a term that's used in CACFP, and creditable grains are nutritious grains that can be served as part of a reimbursable meal or snack. There's 5 types of grains that can be considered creditable, and they include whole grains, so everything with the kernel, an enriched grain, so it could be stuff that has bran and germ taken off, but then vitamins added back in, and then it could be the bran or the germ too. And it could also be a fortified breakfast cereal that meets sugar limit requirements. Notice that we don't have refined grain on this list. That's the white rice that we were looking at in previous slides. Unlike refined grains, all of the options on this slide contain both the bran or the germ, or they have extra vitamins added back in. And we want to make sure that the grains served as part of your CACFP meals are nutritious and that the grain products meeting one of these 5 categories will make sure that they're contributing important B vitamins and fiber to your participants' diet. When you go out to the grocery stores, there's going to be a lot of great creditable grain options to choose from. Again, all grain items that's served as a part of a reimbursable CACFP meal or snack must have one of these 5 categories. Let's explore some of the common creditable grains you may find out in the world by going through each type of creditable grain in more depth. So the first category of creditable grains are whole grains. So we were discussing this earlier with our key terms, and if you're still a little confused about it, feel free to pull up the slides and look at that image of the grain kernel. Whole grains, remember, is a term for a grain that contains all parts of the grain kernel. It has the bran, the endosperm, and the germ all included in it, so it doesn't have anything taken out. All whole grains are creditable grains, and they can be used in the CACFP. On the screen, you see some of the whole grains you might find in a grocery store or a vendor page. And you can find this full list on the USDA handout titled Identifying Whole Grain-Rich Foods for the CACFP. And you can download this under the Handouts tab. And some of the most common items include brown rice, corn masa, graham flour, oatmeal, and whole wheat flour. So you don't have to worry about copying all of those down. If you want a list, you can feel free to just download those slides. The second, third, and fourth categories of creditable grains are enriched grains, bran, and germ. While this is not as nutritious as whole grains, enriched grains, remember, they're the refined grains that have extra nutrients added back in. And the bran and germ are both nutritious parts of those grain kernels. So again, that Identifying Whole Grain-Rich Foods handout, it has a list of common enriched grains, some common bran and germ ingredients as well. Some of the common ones you might see in stores include enriched corn flour. So remember that example we saw earlier? It wasn't enriched. So if it had been enriched, it would be creditable. Enriched durum flour is another example, enriched rice, enriched wheat flour. You typically won't see germ or bran served by themselves, but corn bran, oat bran, wheat bran, they're pretty common ingredients in a lot of cereals and bread products. The last category of creditable grains include fortified breakfast cereals. So you might think, well, all the rest are ingredients. Why are we talking about a food item? Fortified breakfast cereals are a little different in CACFP because they have a little more rules to them. You have to meet first the fact that they're fortified. They need to have added vitamins and minerals to them if they're not whole grain or enriched already. And they also need to have a sugar limit threshold of no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce of cereal. These are the 2 qualifications. Let's go over both of them. So when we talk about fortification, it means that we're adding in extra vitamins and minerals. And it's a lot like being enriched. It's just that instead of enriching one particular ingredient, we're enriching the whole product. And the section that's highlighted in the blue box on the screen shows the vitamins and minerals that were added to the cereal. All of your cereals will look very similar to this if they're fortified. So let's talk about the sugar limit threshold then. All breakfast cereals must have sugar levels below the threshold of 6 grams per dry ounce of cereal. 1 dry ounce is about 28 grams, and you can convert this to about 6 grams of sugar allowed per 28 grams of cereal. Or if you want to use a typical serving size that most people use, it'll be about 21 grams of sugar for every 100 grams of cereal. It sounds like a lot of math, but don't worry. We don't want you to calculate it out yourself. We have tools for this. There are 2 different tools you can use. There is the WIC Breakfast Cereal List, or you can use the CACFP Sugar Limit Wallet Card. So let's talk about the WIC Breakfast Cereal List first. WIC is also known as the Women, Infant, and Children's Program, and they're a program that's very similar to CACFP in their nutritional requirement, and so they have a sugar limit threshold that is very much the same as CACFP. All of the cereals that are allowed on their program is also allowed on CACFP too. This is very convenient for us since they work with actual products that can be easily found and purchased in stores. Any cereal you see on this list is a creditable cereal. And there is a link to the handout on this slide. It's under the title over here, and I have my cursor over it right now. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to go ahead. Oops, I just skipped right ahead. So I'm just going to move it over. So it's the link on the top right of the slide. Just so you're aware, the WIC list is updated in Oregon about once every 2 years, and you'll notice that this list was last updated on March 1st, 2019. Be on the lookout in the next year for an updated list. Note that cereals that are not on this list can still qualify and meet that sugar limit threshold. The WIC list does not include all of the creditable cereals that's out there. It only includes select cereals that's allowed as part of the WIC program. If you're out there in Eastern Oregon or up in Northern Oregon or Southern Oregon, you're also welcome to use WIC lists from other states. All states have the exact same criteria for their WIC breakfast cereals. If the cereal you want to use is not on the WIC list, then you can determine whether it qualifies by looking at the CACFP Sugar Limit Wallet Card. The link to this card is available on your slides, so you can also go ahead and click on that link that's on the top right of your slide. And to use the card, you need to have the nutrition facts label and compare the serving size and total sugars to the columns on the card. This is a good thing to use, a good tool to use, especially if like some people on the questions tab said, they have cereals that they're being told is not creditable. Why is it not creditable? You might want to take a look at your nutrition facts. You're going to want to take a look first at the serving size on the nutrition facts, and you're going to look at the gram serving. So we have 23 grams over there. You're going to compare that to the sugar limit cereal column serving size and try to find where 23 fits in. And we see it fits in right between 22 to 25 grams. And then we're going to inch over to the other column to the right where it says sugars. And so you see for any cereal that's between 22 to 25 grams per serving, you can only have up to 5 grams of sugar. Let's take a look at our nutrition facts again and look at the total sugars. And you see that the total sugars is only 3 grams. So it's right underneath 5 grams, right? We're all good there. So this would be a cereal you can use because it meets the sugar limit threshold. If you want some step-by-step written instructions, you want some time to digest this, you can go ahead and click on the link at the bottom of the slide that says how to use the CACFP Sugar Limit Wallet Card, and that will take you to a handout. Just a quick caveat though, this was created before the nutrition facts label got a little bit of an overhaul. So instead of total sugars, it'll say sugars on there, but it means the exact same thing. Take a look at that. Good tools to have. Once you figure out which cereal you're going to be serving, you need to also make sure that you're documenting it on your menus. For breakfast cereals, there's definitely additional documentation that's required. Make sure you have the name of your cereal. Instead of just writing cereal on the menu, you have to add in whether it's Cheerios, Corn Flakes, Kix, whatever. Then for all of the cereals listed on the menu, you have to make sure that you're keeping supporting documentation that proves that the cereals meet the thresholds. If you're using a cereal on the WIC breakfast list, all you have to do is keep that current WIC breakfast list and then keep the packaging showing that the cereal you're serving matches with one of the WIC breakfast cereal list items. If you're not using one of the WIC cereals, what you'll have to do is to keep the cereal packaging and then keep the nutrition facts label for it as well. the one that shows the serving size and the total sugar. And you're going to want to double check, make sure that the total sugar is within the threshold. Do remember that you do want to keep these supporting documentation on file because it helps prove that your breakfast cereals are creditable. Now that we kind of went over some of these creditable grains, it's time for another poll. So you know that we have 5 categories of creditable grains, and they are, what are they? They are whole grains, enriched grains, bran, germ, and fortified breakfast cereals. Out of these items, which one is not a creditable grain? Is it white rice? Is it whole wheat bread? Is it oatmeal? Is it wheat bran? Or is it Cheerios? And if you do need a refresher, take a look at your slides. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and just give you a few more seconds. Okay, so closing the poll now. All right, good job, everybody. So the vast majority of you got it. So it is white rice. Why is it white rice? White rice is a refined grain, and refined grains, remember, has all of those nutrients taken out, the bran and the germ are taken out, and then nothing added back in. It would not be a creditable grain. Everything else, whole wheat bread, oatmeal, wheat bran, Cheerios, that's on the WIC list, those are all creditable grains that you can serve in CACFP. Great job. Now that we have a better understanding of what a creditable grain is, let's kind of go on to the flip side and talk a little bit about non-creditable grains. You know that all grains served in CACFP has to be creditable. You know what makes up a creditable grain. So let's kind of delve a little bit more deeply on the non-creditable grains and why they're not creditable. When we say non-creditable, what we mean is that if these grain items are served in a CACFP meal or snack as part of the grain component, the meal or snack will not be reimbursable. Non-creditable grains include refined grains that have not been enriched, like that white rice we were talking about earlier. It also includes alternative flours and ingredients, so these can be bean, nut, or vegetable flours. It can also be grain-based desserts, such as granola bars, cereal bars, cakes, cookies, sweet rolls, toaster pastries, all those stuff. Of course, it also includes breakfast cereals that have a sugar content greater than 6 grams per dry ounce and or are not fortified, whole grain, or enriched. Let's go over each of these in a little more detail. When we talk about refined grains, remember that these are the grains that don't have quite as much nutrients as whole grains or enriched grains. They're actually not that common in the grocery store nowadays, and you might encounter it sometimes, especially if you're looking at a lot of specialty items. So always check your ingredient list first before you purchase an item. Take a look at the 3 ingredient list examples on the screen. The first is a white basmati rice, and rice is one of the most common refined grain products out there. So when you're buying rice, if it is white rice and it doesn't have the words enriched in it, or if it doesn't have a list of vitamins added to it, then the rice is refined, and unfortunately you can't use that for CACFP. The second example is organic semolina durum wheat flour. Organic, you think it's great, right? But unfortunately, because it's not enriched and it's a white rice that's refined, you can't use it. There's a lot of name brand pastas that are enriched. So there's definitely lots of products out there that you can use. So just make sure you're choosing the right ones. Finally, you have the last example, which has more ingredients in there. You have wheat flour, degerminated yellow corn meal. So remember, it's taking out that germ from the yellow corn. So these are all refined grains. And since there's no additional vitamins or minerals being added back in, then it's refined and not creditable. So we have a growing category here of non-creditable grains and alternative flours and ingredients. These can be often found in gluten-free products. So some of the more common products include almond flour, chickpea flour, tapioca flour, soy flour, potato flour, red lentil flour. It includes all bean, nut, and vegetable flours. If you're into nutrition, it might seem pretty obvious to you that, well, beans, nuts, and vegetables, those aren't grains, right? But by milling it into a flour, these ingredients are incorporated into products that we typically associate with grain products, like breads and pastas. So while these flours will not credit for the grain components, some of these flours, like potato flour and red lentil flour, they can be creditable for the vegetable component. You do want to be careful about that though and make sure that it's not a combination food item. It gets trickier if it is. Red lentil flour and chickpea flour may also be creditable for the meat alternate component as well. So most of the time, these alternate flours, they won't be the only flour ingredient in your product. Instead, they're probably mixed in with other ingredients. They're sometimes presented as a flour blend. And so there's some general rules to follow when you see alternative flours in your ingredient mixes. If the alternative flour is the first ingredient on your ingredient list, then the product will not be creditable for the grain component. If you see alternative flours in like small amounts in an ingredient list, the product may still be creditable or whole grain rich. It really depends on the rest of the ingredients that's in there. If, however, the alternative flour is found in large quantities, and when I say large quantities, I mean they're one of the first 3 grain or flour ingredients on the label, then you will need a product formulation statement showing that the item has sufficient creditable grains in order to serve the item. So we're going to talk a little bit more about it later when we talk about whole grain rich items and the rule of 3, but just kind of wanted to add that in there since it's something we're seeing a little bit more of recently. Grain-based desserts is the next category of non-creditable grains. The reason why it's not creditable is because they are an added source of sugars and saturated fats. Thankfully, we don't make you figure out fat or sugar content for all of your grain items. Instead, desserts are just categorically non-creditable. To determine which products are considered grain-based desserts, you can check out Exhibit A. So this is shown on the screen, and we have a link on your slide that you can click on to take you to it. All items that's listed in red or with a footnote 3 or 4, those will be considered grain-based desserts. Some of the common grain-based desserts include breakfast bars, brownies, cakes, cereal bars, granola bars, cookies, sweet pie crust, sweet rolls, and toaster pastries. So the main thing that we say is that grain-based desserts are determined based on general consensus. If you typically consider this item to be a dessert or a treat, then it's likely going to be a grain-based dessert, and it won't be creditable for CACFP. And just remember, breakfast cereals that exceed sugar limit will not be creditable. It's kind of like grain-based dessert. It has a little too much sugar in them. And if served, it will result in non-reimbursable meals and or snacks. So we went through creditable grains, non-creditable grains. So you can kind of see the big broad categories here side by side. On the creditable side, we have whole grains, enriched grains, bran, germ, and fortified breakfast cereals that's below our sugar limit threshold. On the non-creditable side, we have non-enriched refined grains, alternative flours and ingredients, grain-based desserts, and breakfast cereals that are not fortified, not enriched, not whole grain, and or with a sugar content above the sugar limit threshold. Just remember, everything you serve in CACFP, you want to be underneath that green check mark. You don't want to be underneath that red X mark. So now that you know which grains are creditable, which grains are not creditable, let's try our next poll. All right, and okay, and this one is check all that applies. Which of the following would be considered non-creditable in the grains component for CACFP? There's definitely more than one, And what we have on there are granola bars, enriched grain waffles, red lentil pasta, white rice, non-enriched, almond cookies. Okay, and if you need some refresher, download those handouts, take a look at the slides, and look at the slide just before this question. I'm going to give you all just about 15 more seconds. I know this one requires a little bit more thinking. All right, no shame in guessing, you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and close and share out what most people said. So it looks like most people got that granola bars are a grain-based dessert, of course. And most people got that white rice. We talked about that quite a few times. Some people thought that red lentil pasta is, and some people thought, well, quite a lot of people thought almond cookies are non-creditable. We're going to see the answers in just a little bit. Okay, so the answers are granola bar, red lentil pasta, white rice, and almond cookies are all non-creditable. The reason for granola bars, which everybody seemed to get, is because it's a grain-based dessert. Enriched grain waffles. Waffles are considered a creditable grain. It's not considered a dessert. So enriched grain waffles, it's enriched. It's a creditable item. Go ahead and serve those. For red lentil pasta, it's an alternative flour. And so red lentil, it could credit for meat alternate or the vegetable component, but it wouldn't credit for the grains component. And this is because red lentil is not a grain. White rice, non-enriched, of course, this is a refined grain, and almond cookies, of course, are grain-based desserts as well. Great job, everybody. Let's move on now to whole grain rich grains. We've talked about whole grain rich a lot in the past, and so you might be able to recite it by memory by now. But grain products that contain at least 50% whole grains and the remaining grains in the food are creditable are considered whole grain rich. So that's our definition of what whole grain rich means. And you have to serve at least one serving of grains each day that meets this definition. That means that if you are serving breakfast, lunch, and snack, all of those have to be creditable. It has to meet one of those creditable categories, but only one of them needs to be whole grain rich. If you're newer to CACFP and maybe you just don't have everything organized in your head about grains just yet, know that whole grain rich grains are always creditable. However, not all creditable grains will be whole grain rich. Okay, so creditable is a much bigger category, and whole grain rich is just a small category within it. So we talked previously about whole grains as a category of creditable grains. What exactly is the difference between whole grain rich and whole grains? They're actually very similar, but because whole grain rich is a term that's specifically used for child nutrition programs, it's much more specific. Whole grains is a general term that you would refer to grain ingredients that contain the whole kernel, like we talked about in the key terms before. So, for example, you could have a whole wheat, that would be a whole grain, right? And then you take a whole lot of those whole wheats, and then you make that wheat into a 100% whole wheat bread, and you get a whole grain rich product. So sometimes you have items like oatmeal, where it's both a whole grain and also a whole grain rich product. It can be a little complicated, but most of the time, if you have items that are entirely whole grains, it will actually be, well, actually all of the times, if you have items that are 100% whole grains, it will also be whole grain rich. In general, you might refer to specific ingredients in CACFP as whole grain, but whole grain rich will generally refer to a grain product that's being served. And this distinction is important because whole grain rich products is only mostly made out of grains. It could be entirely made out of grains, but it could also be only mostly made out of grains. And then the rest of the grains has to be creditable grains, like enriched grains, bran, and germ. Most of the time when we talk though, We typically say we're serving whole grain this or whole grain that, or we say that our menus are full of whole grain items, when what we mean to say is that we're serving a lot of whole grain rich products and that we have a lot of whole grain rich products on our menus. This is okay, language is not perfect. So as long as everybody has the same understanding and that you have the understanding of what whole grain rich is, that's fine. It's really easy to think, well, whole grains are whole grains. But when it comes to marketing though, whole grains on the package doesn't always mean that it meets whole grain rich requirements. The main times where this is going to be an issue is when you or your staff buys item that says made with whole grains or contains whole grains on the package. But if you take a look at the ingredients on the ingredient list, you'll see that the first item on the ingredient list isn't even a whole grain. It's made with whole grains, but it's not made mostly with whole grains. It can be a little tricky sometimes, but you want to make sure that the product meets that definition of whole grain rich. Let's take a look at some methods of how you can do that. I know we've gone over this before in previous sessions. If you haven't looked at those sessions, you don't have to worry about all 6 methods. What we found really is that most people use 2 different methods. They use either method number 1, which is they use the WIC list, or they use method number 6, which is called the rule of 3. We're going to go over both of those, and the first method is the WIC whole grain list. You saw the WIC breakfast cereal list, and now we have the WIC whole grain list. And just the same as the WIC breakfast list, every state has one, and they all have a slightly different list. And then all of the foods that's listed on the whole grain list will meet the definition of whole grain rich. So these lists are really helpful since they include brand names that you can find in stores. And you can see here that this was created on March 1st, 2019. So just like the WIC breakfast cereal list, it will likely be updated sometime later this year. Speaking of the WIC breakfast list, we also have WIC breakfast list, and it has an icon on there. That's that little purple circle with a W. And then anything with this W on there will be considered a whole grain rich cereal. So 50% of all of the cereals on the WIC list has to be whole grain rich. And so you're going to want to take a look if you're looking at the Oregon list for this W icon. And it's very important to know that not all of the cereals on here will meet whole grain rich requirements. They're all going to be creditable. They're all going to meet that sugar limit, but they're not all going to have that purple circle. So that means that your Berry Berry Kix has that W there and it's whole grain rich. However, your Chex, Blueberry Chex over here does not, so it won't meet whole grain rich using this method. Let's take a look at the rule of 3. A lot of times people think of the rule of 3 as being very confusing, but all it is looking at your ingredient list, looking at the first 3 grain ingredients if you have up to 3, and then making a judgment call there. The first part of the rule of 3 is that you need to look at the first grain ingredient. If the first ingredient is a whole grain, so has the whole kernel, and if you're not sure if an item is whole grain, take a look at those common whole grain lists that you have. And then if there are any other grain ingredients on there, so the next 2 grain ingredients, if there are creditable grains, then the grain is whole grain rich. So you only need to look at the grain ingredients. You don't need to look at any of the other ingredients on there. There are other things that look like grain ingredients that you can disregard. So this include grain derivatives and ingredients that's less than 2% of product weight. Now that we know what the rule of 3 is and what we can disregard, let's take a look at this corn tortilla. We have our first ingredient, which is corn masa. That's a whole grain. And then we have a disregarded item, cornstarch. We can just kind of throw that out the window. And once you take a look at the rest of the ingredient list, you don't have any other grains. So In this case, this item is considered whole grain rich because you have one ingredient that's a grain, and that ingredient is a whole grain. So this product is 100% whole grains and it meets the definition of whole grain rich. That was a really easy example. Most of the time you have more complicated examples, usually not quite as complicated as this one, but I wanted to show this to you because flour blends actually are getting much more popular. You have a flour blend, which is one ingredient followed by a list of sub-ingredients in the parentheses. So these are known as flour blends. And in cases like this, if the flour blend is the first ingredient, every single item in that blend has to be a whole grain. If the flour blend is the second or third ingredient, then all of the ingredients in the second or third flour blend has to be made with either whole grains or a mix of other creditable grains in order to meet that rule of 3. Taking a look at our ingredient on there, you have whole grain flour, and then everything else in there is whole grain, so that meets our first requirement. You have your second flour blend after water, and then everything in there, so gram flour, it's whole grain, enriched wheat flour, so that's enriched, so that's creditable, enriched corn flour, that's creditable, and wheat bran, that's also creditable. So everything in the second flour blend is also creditable. So that means that this item, is also whole grain rich. If you do have flour blends with non-creditable flours, and that flour blend is one of the first 3 grain ingredients, then that would make the blend non-creditable, and your item would not meet the rule of 3, and it wouldn't be considered whole grain rich. So you do want to be careful with the flour blend and kind of go through it and look at those lists of common grain items. Do remember, whole grain rich items do have additional documentation requirements. Remember that you have to list which items are whole grain on your menu. We generally see WG, WGR. If you're dedicated to only serving whole grain rich item, you can have a blanket statement at the bottom saying that everything you serve is whole grain rich. Remember though that if you're committing to that, you have to save every single grain documentation. So that means you have to save all the ingredient lists, all the packaging. So just remember that when you're kind of thinking about developing your menus. If your item is on the WIC food list, make sure you're saving that WIC list and then saving the packaging, showing that it matches with the WIC list. If you are using the rule of 3, making sure that you're saving that packaging again and then also the ingredient list. And make sure that your ingredient list shows that it does meet the rule of 3. So we're going to take a look at this example, and because we're a little short on time, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do all of this together. We're going to take a look at this ingredient list and take a look at that first ingredient. Is that first ingredient a whole grain? So think about it, whole wheat flour, I would say yes, right? The second ingredient is a flour blend. And so let's look at all of the ingredients in that blend. Is enriched wheat flour creditable? Yes. Oat flour, is it creditable? Yes. Gram flour, is it creditable? Yes. Enriched corn flour, is that creditable? Yes, because it's enriched. Enriched barley flour, yes. And brown rice flour, yes. And then the last one, the last grain item is wheat bran. And so yes, that is also a creditable grain. So this meets the rule of 3 because the first grain was a whole grain, the second flour blend all had creditable grains, and then the third grain was also creditable too. We're going to skip this poll, but the answer is going to be yes. And again, first grain is a whole grain, second grain is a flour blend, all flour blend grains are creditable, and the third grain is creditable too. Okay, so it meets the rule of 3. And if you're still confused about this, I know we went through it pretty quickly. We do have a chart for determining creditable and whole grain rich grains. What you see on the screen is the front and the back page. And I'm going to pull up this middle page in here. and that is the step 2 flowchart, and that helps you determine if items are whole grain rich or not. And it goes through all 6 methods. So if you wanted to see what methods are out there, you can take a look at this. And there is a link for you under the slides up above that handout. And if you want a good overview of the grain component and you just kind of want to take some time to read about it, take a look at the CACFP Crediting Handbook. This was just released in spring of 2020, and it has a very detailed explanation of creditable and whole grain rich grains. It also has lists of common whole grains and enriched grains, and it has a very useful chart on different common grain items and whether they're creditable or not. And if they're not, they tell you why. So there is a link available on this slide up there up top on the title. And if you want, you can also download it under our handouts tab. It is the last handout that I have on there. And it'll be a pretty big PDF, but it has lots of great information in there. And so if you're looking for easy to digest handouts, Team Nutrition has developed a lot of different handouts, and you can use it for your staff. You can use it to help train new people. And so they have the Identifying Whole Grain Rich handout that I included in our Handouts tab. They also have a handout just on grain-based desserts. So if you're having trouble figuring out which items are grain-based desserts, you can download that one. That's the one on the left. And they also have how to spot whole grain rich foods as a handout too. So these are all great resources. It's available in both English and Spanish. They have some print versions available if you want to order it from USDA. So that link will take you to each of those handouts, and they'll also have print order links available through them. I mentioned early in the webinar that ounce equivalents will be required starting October 1st, 2021. So we're going to have more information for you later, but just know that you are allowed to use ounce equivalents instead of the current serving sizes right now. In practice, it's really not very different. Ounce equivalents is just a little bit bigger than the serving sizes right now, but most people actually serve way more than the minimum serving size. So most of the time, the difference is about 3 grams of grain. And so if you're familiar with how much a gram is, that's really not a lot at all when it comes to grains. The reason why we're using ounce equivalents is because it's much more precise. So instead of saying I'm serving 1 slice of bread, where 1 slice can be like a Texas toast size of bread, or it could be a tiny little diet slice of bread, it says I'm serving 1 ounce equivalent of bread, or that's about 28 grams worth of grains. You can see Exhibit A on the screen, and so you might be familiar with this for looking at grain-based desserts, but actually what it's for is for portion sizes. And so you can see here in the middle, it tells you what the portion size is under ounce equivalents. And on the other column to the right, it tells you minimum serving sizes, which is what we're currently using. If you're interested in it, take a look at it. You'll find most likely that most of your grains exceed even the ounce equivalent serving sizes. I won't worry about it too much, but just kind of preparing you for the fact that we're going to be rolling over to ounce equivalents next year. All right, so more to come later on. Just as a reminder, these are the main points that we went over today. Just remember, all grains served in CACFP has to be creditable, and creditable grains include whole grains, enriched grains, bran, germ, and fortified breakfast cereal, meeting sugar limits. Remember that at least once per day, the grain component has to be whole grain rich. You do have to serve grains at breakfast, lunch, and supper. It can also be one of the components served at snack. And once 2021 comes around, I know it seems like a long time off, but October 1st, 2021, we're going to be rolling over to ounce equivalents. Thank you for watching the CACFP Meal Pattern webinar on creditable and whole grain rich grains. ODE is committed to equity and excellence for every learner, and we want to make sure that our communities are supported in their goal to reach equitable implementation of policy, practices, procedures, and legislation. This institution is an equal opportunity provider.